The Story Time with Kathy Part 2, and we are the next segment of A Diplomat's Daughter. Linda has just told her husband George that she's going to Brussels. She has not told him why yet, so we'll take it from that last question he had last time. Really? Wow. Well, I'll see if I can get time off, but it's short notice for a vacation, isn't it? He queried. George, I want to go alone, I stated as I glanced at his eyes. His eyes fixed intensely on mine as he stammered. What is this about, Linda? Why are you suddenly going to Brussels? Well, it was actually that box my mother brought over, I began. It started me thinking about the time that I lived there. I got in touch with a friend of mine on the school website, and she invited me to a reunion they are having at the school next week. I just want to take a quick trip there to go to the reunion and reminisce. We left there so suddenly when my father died. Maybe I'm trying to heal old wounds. I don't know. And since my friend Brenda lives there now, there'll be no need to worry. Okay, but you don't even have a passport, he asked. Yes. I had forgotten about that. I do have a passport. Remember? We got them together a few years ago when I was doing the bookkeeping for the travel agency, and we thought we might start traveling more, I answered quickly. But I don't think we've ever used them. Bam! George's fist hit the table. His eyes narrowed as he shouted, No, you can't go. It's not a good idea, damn it. What are you talking about? I cried. I was stunned by his outburst. He clenched his jaw and his brows furrowed. Please just trust me on this, he said. Tears flooded my eyes as I left the table. Sorry, George, but I have to go, I said quietly as I walked to my desk. My hands were shaking as I logged onto the computer and searched for a flight to Brussels. The guilt I was feeling over not fully divulging the reasons for my trip began to dissipate as I thought how selfish he was acting. He was making it easier to leave than he realized. How could I have not seen this controlling side of him before? I booked a flight leaving the next Thursday with a connection in New York. That way I could rest all day Friday before gearing up for the big weekend. Perfect. When I asked Brenda for a hotel recommendation, she insisted I stay at her flat. She said she would meet me at the baggage claim at the airport, and she would be wearing a red leather jacket. I could hardly wait. Later that night, however, as I lay in the stillness of my bed, sadness crept slowly upon me. Not only was this trip stirring up memories of the ending of that precious teenage romance, it was exposing the latent grief over my father's death and tearing me apart from my gentle soulmate of over 30 years. Tears filled my eyes as I laid awake most of the night. The days leading up to the trip passed slowly as we acknowledged each other's existence, politely. Finally, Thursday morning arrived and George drove me to the airport silently. I put on sunglasses to shield my eyes from the sharp reflection of the sun as it glared off passing cars and the white concrete of the highway. I hated goodbyes, and I wondered how we would part at the airport. My question was answered quickly as he drove directly to the terminal and unloaded my bags. Well, I began, thank you for the ride. I'll call you when I get there, and I guess I'll see you next week. I smiled and leaned forward for the customary goodbye kiss. George stood motionless. His eyes were squinted and his lips pressed tightly together, as if he were trying to control another outburst. He grabbed my arm, jerked me toward him, and said, Things will never be the same between us, you know. Like an animal caught in the claws of a predator, I stood still, waiting for him to release me. My heart thumped loudly as he drew me closer and squeezed my arm harder. I closed my eyes and felt his hot breath on my neck, and still I said nothing. When he finally dropped my arm, I looked at him quickly and noticed a single tear running down his cheek as he turned, slammed the door, and drove off. I was shaking as I gathered my bags, entered the terminal, and began navigating my way to the airport gate. Reading signs and waiting in line proved a welcome distraction. Finally, I boarded the short flight to JFK, sat cramped between a surfer, perhaps with earphones permanently affixed to his head, and a businessman, and tried not to think about George. After a turbulent change of planes in New York, I nestled myself in the middle row of a larger aircraft and prepared for the long flight to Brussels. I read the magazines in the seat pouches in front of me and tourist brochure cover to cover in an attempt to keep my mind off the encounter with George. It was clear to me now, though, that my spirit as well as my arm had been bruised. Was this trip a terrible mistake, I asked myself? My lip began to quiver as I imagined my life without him. A soft nudge to my left arm brought my attention to the well-groomed family of 4 with whom I shared the row. A boy of about 10 years old squirmed in his seat as he played a small electronic game beside me. He was intensely focused on the game while his brother played a similar game, and his mother rested her head on the shoulder of her husband. They were a quiet, well-behaved group, which reminded me of my family when we flew to Brussels over 35 years ago. As I recall, my sister and I had small dolls instead of electronic games, and we wore freshly pressed dresses, as was customary at the time. It was one of my first flights, and my mother was quite stern with her directions as she guided us through the journey. I remember how electrifying it was to be surrounded by the sounds of other languages and the unfamiliar sights of a new city when we first arrived. Everything from the ornate architecture of the buildings to the elongated shape of the doorknobs and rough texture of the toilet paper was fascinating. We lived in a small apartment temporarily in the older part of the city, where my sister and I began exploring the local shops. How brave we felt when at 10 and 11 years old we walked together down cobblestone streets, entered a small store, and attempted to buy a trinket while speaking French. A luxurious small bus would pick us up in the pitch-black early morning hours and transport us to school every day, while my mother tended to household duties. My father was sharply dressed as a faceless driver took him to the embassy each day in a large black sedan. Within a few months, we were settled in a spacious house in a modern neighborhood. A larger bus delivered us to school each day, and my mother's duties now included arranging elegant dinner parties and directing the household staff. My father was a naval attaché at the embassy, which, as far as I could tell, simply meant he was driven to work, he went to a lot of parties, and he collected some kind of secret information. We played tennis at the local country club, vacationed in the south of France, and continued with our busy lives for several years until one tragic day when everything came to an abrupt end. I remember entering the house after school with a fresh kiss from Jim on my lips and hearing my mother crying. She was seated on the couch in the living room while 2 men in dark suits stood near her. I was frightened as she motioned my sister and me to sit beside her. She dabbed her eyes with a wet tissue as she told us that our father had been killed earlier that day. The 2 men watched us closely as she described what had happened. He had his driver stop at a store he routinely goes to on the way to work to buy a newspaper or some silly thing, and when he stepped out of the car, she choked, he was shot to death by someone driving by. The news spread like an electrical current through my body. I was paralyzed at first, and then overcome with grief. My mother's despair was so great she could do little to console my sister or me. The only explanation she had for the shooting was that it must have been a politically charged killer who had it out for American diplomats. She said it was a dangerous world outside of the United States. Fearing I would upset my mother more than necessary, I cried alone at night as I struggled to come to terms with the death of my father and to comprehend the concept of death in general. Her emotions gradually steadied as we busied ourselves packing up the household items and preparing for the move back to the U.S. For me, however, it was not so easy. By all appearances, I had bounced back quickly as I chatted cheerfully and was eager to lend a helping hand, but on the inside things were not the same. The loss of my father had been a huge blow to my tender psyche, and when compounded with the ending of my blossoming social life, It simply caused me to shut down. We stayed near Langley in Virginia at first, which was where I had intended to meet up with Jim. His father was due to be transferred there within a few months after we arrived. He wrote me enthusiastically at first, and then the letters suddenly stopped coming. After my mother attended to matters there, we settled with my grandparents in Ohio, where she soon remarried, and my life continued uneventfully. I made sure of it. I lived robotically, keeping my emotions at an even keel, as I did everything that was expected of me. I was terrified to do otherwise. "Ma'am, would you like a drink?" I heard in the distance. "Ma'am, a drink?" the stewardess asked again. And we'll stop here. So Linda's about to get to Brussels, and I assure you it's going to be one bumpy and unexpected ride when we get there. So I'll talk to you next time for Storytime with Kathy. Bye-bye.